who has been spending quite a lot of time analyzing masses of material. At one point we were calling it death by data, but she's alive. Resurrected, okay. I'm going to start without the pictures, and they will appear, I think. We find a challenge of the challenge that we had in order to do this research was how do you evaluate something that nobody has actually been evaluating? There's the questions that are being posed to us by policymakers. They would like to know how can we invest public funding possibly legitimately in developing something if we don't have the evidence that it works. Managers who haven't yet tried artistic interventions are also asking the question, how do we know it works before we step onto this unknown territory? Some intermediaries and artists would also like to know more about what it is they're doing and how does it work. And researchers were always curious. We would always like to understand dynamics better. What I find quite striking is the people who are not asking us whether it works and how it works are the managers and companies that have been doing it. We've got managers who've had several artistic interventions in their organizations. So I thought, great, I'm going to be able to answer the questions being posed by the policymakers, by the other managers who haven't yet tried, by the intermediary advisors. I can ask the managers who've done it and say, give me the evidence. They say that they trust their instincts. They watch people in the organizations, they see things happening, and that's the evidence that they need. So they have rarely actually conducted research. Nevertheless, we did find, let me see if I do this right. We did find quite a few publications. We found around 268 publications by practitioners, by academics, people from the world of arts and business, in English particularly, in German, and also in some other languages. However, only 47 of those that we had access to actually were research-based. So there's lots of quotes, there's lots of claims, but in terms of research we found 47, of which we have been recently conducting 4 of them. We're fortunate there's more doctorate students who are becoming interested in this. I think we have some students here. Please complete your studies and give us some more evidence of what is happening when artists enter organizations. Since quite a few of these studies included more than one company, we have our data right now on 205 cases. And Michael Hutter was emphasizing a moment ago that it's happening in all the different industries. And you can see from the data here that we have the largest sectors are healthcare and education, and among the smallest sector are the creative industries themselves. Across the board, we have different kinds of organizations involved in trying to discover new things, realizing that if you want innovation, surprisingly enough, it's useful to work with innovative methods, and artistic interventions represent those. Most of the research that we have found is qualitative. Some have a few quantitative elements to it, but it's essentially qualitative research, which is not surprising in this complex question. We was interested to see that quite a few of the studies take a multi-stakeholder approach. And that I hadn't expected. I thought that most of the time they were just asking the managers who know what happens in their organization to tell people what's happening in their organization. But many studies have involved asking employees about their impressions about what's been happening. And some have also, for example, asked the artist or even the intermediary. And it's useful, we found, to involve the intermediaries in these studies because they have multiple cases. They're quite good at comparing under what conditions, what sort of effects have been happening. Many of them apply mixed methods, largely interviews, participant observation, and we've started some surveys in our research at the BZB. We started using internet-based surveys to see if we can elicit more free responses from people in the organization who play on the computer at any time of day or night. I'm going to show you something very briefly. Yes. The mass of data that Anke and her friends did not die of got sorted into 29 categories of impacts, 8 groups. You have in your packs, you have the research report. You have a limited edition of the research report, meaning that we're still revising it. But this isn't explained in there, so I'm not going to take our conference time right now to explain this complicated graph. I'll just go through some of the impacts that we identified and hope that you enjoy reading your copy of the report. As you can guess, policymakers and the managers who haven't yet tried artistic interventions ask particularly about strategic, operational types of impacts. And we did find some evidence of those. We found evidence of improvements in profitability, of turnover, and other things. For example, we have a construction manager in Copenhagen who worked with Art Lab. Where is the other? Art Lab. This is Art Lab. For example, he wrote, after having participated in intervention, this year we have seen an increase in our turnover of just over 30%. That's a lot. Of course, there may be many factors. You realize this. Of course, there may be many factors that explain this improved efficiency. But one of them is that this group works fantastically well together. Firstly, this group is a unit, i.e. if one of them says something, then the rest stand by it. This means clear and unambiguous communication. Secondly, if one of them has a problem, then the group have been able to disregard their personal interests to help that person in question. This means that things get now done incredibly quickly. Another factory manager in Sweden, he explains that in the year following the artistic intervention project, there was a 20% increase in production, a dramatic increase we haven't seen before. Sick leave is falling too. For him, even more importantly, before the project, only 5% of employees responded to a questionnaire on quality of life at work. Post-project, 95% responded. It seems they're engaging themselves, as his interpretation. It seems they're engaging themselves, and they also meet now after work, share time together. So he's noticing different elements that for him provide the evidence this was significant. But he's realizing when you talk in terms of increases in productivity, efficiency, turnover, that there's a multiplicity of factors. Like Michael Hutter was emphasizing, you can't just have one monocausal relationship. What I find most striking when people are talking in terms of these kind of results is that they also talk with their hands like I do, and they say what happens is that they open the box for us and widen our expectations of what was even possible. Some of them have said, before we worked with the artists, we would have just done another marketing campaign. And working with the artists, working with these artful methods, we realized we can aspire to something much bigger, and have sometimes developed a totally new product or a new project, rather than limiting themselves to the idea they had at the outset of how the artist can help us tweak this a bit or improve that or make it look nice. They realize it's not just about making things look nice, it's about making things really qualitatively different. And this sense of we can aspire to more, we can open things, create more space, I think is what energizes people when they talk about the impacts of artistic interventions for them. The effects that people wanted to talk about most are actually at the other end of the image. If you look at this image reverses what I was showing to you a moment ago. They want us to tilt perspectives back to our friends from Sweden. To understand this, we've got to look at what happens when artists enter organizations. They enter and they see a place that has formalized, institutionalized ways of doing things. They see the organizational culture, they see the structure of the organization. And they also engage with the informal organization. They realize there's many things happening in an organization that's not in the books. That's what makes things work. So people find ways of working together in an organization, and those sort of hidden rules, assumptions, that's what the artist also engage with. So the artist enters with both parts of the organization. And what the impacts they have on that is what seems to make people excited about talking about artistic interventions, is what seems to me to be what enables the effects to happen that we talked about at the outset. When Anke and her colleagues and I were looking at this data, the thing that struck us the most was how artistic interventions create what we're calling interspaces, and Michael referred to them a few moments ago. Create a space of possibilities that is wider, that's bigger, that's newer, that enables more to be thought, to be said, to be done, to be tried, than exists normally in the institutionalized, established organization and its established rules and ways of working and structure. So we looked more at that when we listened for the impacts of artistic interventions in the reports. And what strikes us are the characteristics of the interspace, of emotions, of energy, and of stimulation. Managers are saying to us, difficult times require new thinking and new energy. This word energies comes up an awful lot in the research that we've been looking at and doing ourselves. Difficult times require new thinking and new energies to, as they say, overcome doubts about their ability to innovate and to deal actively and creatively with the challenges they face individually and collectively. What happens in the course of artistic interventions is that people have opportunities to try thinking, doing, seeing things in new ways, and they often, in the course of an intervention, create what people are referring to as illuminating representation, something that captures the spirit of the new ideas, of the new ways of working. Artists sometimes produce those illuminating representations, but often it's the employees themselves. To give you just two very brief examples, in a company that we were studying, this is one of our projects, the company was studying in Paris. The artist accompanied the members of the organization throughout their days, and after a meeting would send back into the group her feedback, her summary of the meeting. An artist summary doesn't look quite the same as a memo that we might write as academics, or you might write in a company. She had noticed and was quite disturbed by the fact that these people worked through their lunch. We're in Paris. They're working through lunch. She thought this was not a healthy way of working. So she sent them afterwards, in order to draw their attention to something they weren't even noticing they were doing. She sent them a photograph of their notebook computers and the screen. She had embedded into the screen a sushi lunchbox. Make them realize, do you realize what you're doing with yourself? Is this really the way you want to be working? Is this how you want to treat your minds and your bodies? Making them stop and make a choice that they had no longer even realized that they had. One kind of example. Another example of an illuminating representation came from projects in Sweden, in Iris. The artist who had gone into the emergency ward of a hospital and was seeing there that people work crazily intensely. We want them to work crazily intensely if it's your body that's being delivered to be taken care of right now. But then there were downtimes, and she noticed that they weren't actually in those downtimes, they were just sort of waiting for the next intense event to happen. They weren't consciously using that downtime in a way that would actually regenerate them. They could. So, being a textile artist, she brought into the emergency area, she brought in a loom, which male and female nurses found to be a very strange thing, to bring a loom into it. They said, we did that in kindergarten, we might do it again when we're 75, but why are we going to be doing any kind of weaving at our age in our jobs? She had noticed that at the end of a day, these reports on the patients were shredded. And she said, you're going to use your materials in order to create something. Do something different. Use your senses differently, use your bodies differently, use your minds differently in the downtime between these intense events. And she had seen that everybody, whenever they did something in that ward, they also had to use a personal symbol to mark that they had taken responsibility for what they did. So she said, so use your symbol also in creating this weaving. Obviously, as in all artistic interventions, there's skepticism people have to deal with, but people got engaged. People discovered it was actually quite stimulating, fun, playful, to be doing something different with their materials, with their time at the time when they weren't actually dealing with an emergency of a patient. And that what we saw was an illuminating representation. This got woven into something that is now hanging in their space as a constant reminder of what are we doing with ourselves in the time that we have an opportunity to regenerate. Some of the employees who hadn't participated are somewhat disappointed that actually they didn't participate in this process, but the reminder is there for them as well. So the effects that the stakeholders seeing in all of the research reports that we've seen and those that we've conducted, what they seem to value most is the change in the organization that is enabled to happen in that experience of the interspace. They find that out of what we had called earlier the institutionalized ways of working, they discovered the potential of artful ways of working with different art forms or with different artful practices. And they discovered that you can move from just working collectively to working collaboratively. And that's based very much on developing relationships in a new way because you actually meet the human being and not just the function. that they represent in the organization. As in one case, I'm afraid I've forgotten which was, the project got conversations going, Sweden, the project got conversations going between the two plants that had not been possible beforehand. There had been invisible walls, even wars, between the shifts. People did not help each other out. But now, after the experience of the artistic intervention that had brought them together as human beings, now they can address issues that had not been discussable before. And then for management, back to our point of efficiency and effectiveness, now they even share shifts. The artist could not have said to them, you will love each other and you will share shifts. That you can't manipulate people back, you can't force that kind of behavior. But people discover that when they see the human being and they realize the problem the human being is dealing with, they can find new ways of working together in the organization. Is Ulla here yet? Ulla Johansson did some studies also in Sweden, and she found, for example, that the people had learned how to use role-playing, and they took it forward in their organizations. She just entered. Ulla, perfect timing. Hello. Timing. Hi, Ulla, I'm quoting you right now. I'm quoting Ulla. Ulla found that the participants had learned that role-playing scenes was very useful, and it became so useful that even after the project had completed, the employees used these games when they were stuck in a situation and didn't know how to solve it. At this point, they asked a colleague to join in with them in role-playing to help them find new solutions to the problem at hand. Thank you, Ulla. The two questions that remain for us, if I quickly outlined, and there's more when you hit the report, if I quickly outline what it is they value most in some of these impacts, there's two questions that remain. How can they be sustained, and how can they be nurtured? How can they be sustained, I think, is a primary responsibility of leadership in organizations. We have, unfortunately, also found in the research quite a few statements from employees who were frustrated by what did not happen afterwards in the organization. With their expectations having been raised, new skills having been developed, new relationships having been opened and discovered, that those possibilities do not get followed up on, there's a huge risk there of potential either simply dissipating. That's bad, that's sad. But far worse, people can become cynical. So if the possibilities that are open in artistic interventions don't get picked up on by management, it's a problem. As an employee in an energy company in Germany says, I believe that the artistic intervention changed the way some of us think, but we don't see management commitment to really making change happen. So long as that's not visible, people here don't see any point in changing themselves. So we see that the energy happens for people undertaking change themselves, but if it doesn't get supported in some way in the organization with leadership acting and doing things differently, changing incentives, changing policies, listening, people don't see the point. But fortunately, we do also have positive examples. Another manager, I know that some of the managers have subsequently transferred the work with actors to the development of their own middle management. So there are possibilities, but it's something that managers need to take on board actively. And I will close now, lastly, just with the challenge to policymakers. Because there's where we see that there's a great need to nurture the ground for this kind of activity in organizations. We see that there's a need for policymakers at the European level, the national level, the regional level, local level, to support the introduction more of artistic interventions with policies, with programs, with new ways of funding, longer-term funding, more interactive funding with other kinds of funding mechanisms. And we believe that if more policymakers themselves engage in experiencing artistic interventions, they might not ask for evidence of that kind because they'd have it in their systems themselves. They'd have evidence that they believe because they generated it through their own experience. So we're hoping that by sharing what we've got now, we will animate more to come. Thank you very much.